Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Dan Lanning, the Oregon Ducks, wrapping up their spring game Saturday afternoon. And Dill, we hopped on, kind of gave some immediate reactions to the game. The boys have gone back into the film, watched it back a couple of times. And I think we both agreed that the biggest storyline and takeaway we had from that spring game is the one position group that we had a lot of question marks about heading into 2024. That was the defensive line that really dominated all Saturday afternoon. And Dill, you look at this Oregon team in terms of just taking a checklist to this Oregon team and say, hey, can this team win a national championship? You look on the offensive side of the football, checks across the board. You look on the defensive side of the football, really, really good secondary. I think our question mark was, do they have difference makers on the defensive line? You watched that game back Saturday afternoon. I think you got your answer, at least part of your answer heading into 2024. Fired the boys up, really excited to get into some of the film, talk about what player stood out the most before we do. And as always, just want to say thank you to you guys, the Oregon Duck fans. That spring breakdown that we did a couple days, I mean, the amount of support y'all show, it just means the absolute world. Cannot thank you guys enough. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Y'all know this is one of our teams heading into 2024. And Dill, I'm going to give you the T-box here. Overarching takeaways from this Oregon defensive line's performance.
I think fundamentally what you're starting to see is them build a extremely deep group of really solid players where you can go three deep of guys who look like they belong at that Division I level. And I think for Lanning's first year or two, maybe you could argue, I mean, they didn't always look like that. Like you had a couple of guys maybe at the top, but when you started to get into those depth pieces, you were like, well, these are good college football players, but they're not like real kind of hammers, really physical, top aggressive. I think that's starting to become more of their calling card. I think they have more lines. And to me, you kind of saw Tatum Tuioti, I think, really take that step to being that's kind of what we've been asking for. Like, who's going to be the man on this defensive line? Who's going to, like, if you're looking to someone to get sacks, rack up those type of things, I think it's going to be him. He looked awesome working on Connor Lee yesterday, who is an extremely good tackle, probably one of the better ones in the country. I'm looking for him to take a big step, and everyone around him, again, continuing to improve, be a little bit more deep.
And like two things to work off you there. One, we spent all spring talking about just about every single name in that room besides Tatum Tuioti. You know, we talked about Mateo, we talked about Blake Purchase, Jordan Birch. He was the guy that really stood out to me as well. But I also want to say something that I also picked up on as well. You start looking at the difference makers on this Oregon defensive line. It's not a coincidence that a lot of those guys are Dan Lanning's guys, right? Guys who are in their first, second, or third year with this program. You can see the blueprint. You can see Dan Lanning's fingerprints all over that defensive line. Dill, let's get into the film and let's highlight Tatum Tuioti first. I mean, this is a guy that I feel bad for not really mentioning him at all spring. I was talking about guys.
The thing is like he's not that like five-star, like all eyes on him. I mean, Jordan Birch, obviously coming from South Carolina, 5-star. Mateo Yu, 5-star. Elijah Rushing, 5-star. Like those guys do command the attention perhaps, and they maybe have better physical traits, but again, we just get into what Tuioti does. He's just such a good passer.
And so the first rep you see, like you can tell he's a coach's son. You talk about mechanics, you talk about polish. This is a guy that understands the game. Working on Josh Connerly Jr., a guy that I think is going to be a top 15 NFL draft pick in 12 months. They'll speed the power. This is a guy that, and this is kind of Dan Lanning's type of guys. You go back to his time at Georgia. He wants defensive linemen that can get right into the chest of offensive linemen. Again, Josh Connerly Jr., one of the best tackles in the country, not only getting into his chest and winning with low pads. I'm going to get off this block and I'm going to go put a quarterback hurry here. Dante Moore ends up throwing an absolute seed to Terrence Ferguson. That's beside the point. You really saw Tatum Tuioti with nothing really special, just that speed to power, how to use his hands, disengage from blocks. Extremely impressive all Saturday afternoon.
In that ability to go from rush move to rush move quickly and at the right time. So he goes in, gets that bull rush going, makes Josh Connerly reset him. And the second Connerly goes to reset him and re-anchor him, he pulls by, he rips by him and does it. He's chaining these pass rush moves together. Exactly kind of what you said, just so polished, so technically proficient. Again, maybe he doesn't have the length, the athleticism, some of those things that some of the other guys have who are those 5-star guys. but just ultra good, ultra polished, and really has that knack for rushing the quarterback that it's hard to teach.
Second rep you got to talk about. And a guy like Jordan Burch, I'm just going to keep banging the table for him. Like, this is a guy that has all the traits to be an elite edge rusher, defensive lineman for this Oregon team. Year 2 under Dan Lanning, you kind of feel like he's going to take that step. This rep, you see both Tatum and Jordan Burch absolutely go to work, right? First, Tatum dealing with the tight end shit, and then getting into Josh Connerly Jr., again, winning with speed to power. You see Jordan Burch, maybe a little bit more juice to him in terms of winning on the outside shoulder on offensive linemen. Both of them getting after the quarterback, closing the distance with Dante Moore. I mean, that is exactly what you want to see. And then the last rep that you're going to take a look at, again, this is exactly how you want this Oregon defensive line to look and how did you want them to operate, where you have Tatum Tuioti, again, going speed to power on your top of your screen. When that offensive lineman goes to re-anchor, hey, we're shedding hands and we're getting after the quarterback. You have to be so fired up with some of the edge rushers' performance on Saturday.
And if Burch can develop a little bit more of that feel for getting on the outside and winning there, because you've seen him. I mean, he's got the power you need to put a lot of pressure on offensive tackles. He's ultra physical. If he can just continue to develop some of that bend, some of that fluidity on the edge, I mean, that's where he takes his next step, and he'll be a good player irregardless of if that gets better in his game. But that's like, then he becomes that player that we've kind of talked about Oregon was probably missing last year when they couldn't go run through Washington like Michigan could, because Michigan had a couple of those guys. That, to me, it's the evolution. Again, I think Tuioti's got it. I think you liked what you saw from Burch, especially what you said, having both showing that power that we all know he had, but having that second kind of pass rush too to work off.
Now, the next couple of reps I want to get into, kind of focusing on the inside of that defensive line. And I guess a precursor is that's not necessarily that Mateo Yu didn't have a good game. Like, Mateo Yu flashed some stuff too. He was a little bit more of a known commodity. Still, on the inside of the defensive line, that was kind of the position where I was saying, does Oregon have enough guys? You kind of got your answer, right? And again, you kind of figure out why, all right, this is why Dan Lanning only went after one guy in Jamari Caldwell. He knows and he sees these guys taking those steps in practice. You take a look at a guy like Ben Roberts. I mean, this is exactly what you want from the inside of your defensive line. And this is exactly what Dan Lanning had at the Georgia Bulldogs in terms of heavy-handed defensive linemen that can just go speed to power, collapse pockets. Ben Roberts, number 52, low pads, a guy that has a ton of power in his hands, just walking this guard right into the lap of the quarterback. This is how you blow up plays. This is exactly how Dan Lanning wants this defense to operate. This last play here, this kind of shows you if Dan Lanning kind of gets what he had at Georgia on this defensive line, this is probably what you want it to look like. You just freeze frame 4 defensive linemen, all going speed to power. That is exactly what you want it to look like. That's exactly what Dan Lanning recruits for. If you're an Oregon fan coming after those couple plays, you got to be fired up about what this is going to look like in 2024.
And to me, that's like the difference, I think, of what you have with the Lanning guys versus the guys you had in the past couple of years, of just like that violence. And I feel like I say that it doesn't really mean that much, but when you watch those couple plays, Amari Washington, Ben Roberts, like when they get their hands on guys, they stun them a little bit more. It just looks a little more violent, a little more physical, a little bit more explosive. And frankly, that's the only way you can really be an elite defensive lineman. I think you need to play with that physicality, that violence. And again, you're starting to see the Dan Lanning guys play with a little bit more of that I feel like sometimes you were missing last year.
I think that's such a good point, is that you look at, and this is not a shot at guys like Popo, Casey Rogers, really solid college football players. There's a reason why I think both of them did not get selected in the NFL draft. Y'all can fact check me on day 3. I kind of got checked out 6 and 7 rounds. But there's a reason that those guys were late day 3 undrafted free agent picks. And then guys like Jamari Caldwell, or the guys that Dan Lanning has recruited, Amari Washington, or guys like Jericho Johnson coming in as true freshman Aiden Breland. There is a different caliber of guy along the line of scrimmage, specifically on that inside. It would be remiss of me not to talk about one of my favorite players on this Oregon defensive line. That's Jamari Caldwell. Coming from Houston, there's a reason they went after Jamari Caldwell. He's a difference maker. He's a little bit of a game wrecker from that inside. He's a guy that can go speed to power, but also wins with his quickness off the line of scrimmage too. You see it on this play where he is a guy that can get penetration early and often in the backfield, making plays. That's exactly what you brought in Jamari Caldwell to look. You look at why Oregon might have fell short in those games against Washington. They didn't have the difference makers up front. They didn't create enough of those negative plays like Michigan did in that national championship game. You bring in Jamari Caldwell and you say, all right, we feel a little bit better about the negative plays that we can manufacture with our front four and the defensive line.
Yeah, and Jamari Caldwell was big just because I think you needed one of those older guys. Like, you would have just been so young on defense line. And again, you kind of like obviously what you're seeing from Washington Roberts. I don't want to not shout out Michael Gardner. I thought he had a really nice day too. So you're seeing the young guys develop. But again, when you want to be deep, you want to have one more guy who's probably played at a little bit higher level at the college level. That's kind of Caldwell, and a guy who, again, like, is he going to be better than those other younger guys? Maybe not by the time those guys are ready to go, but right now he does provide that polish, that experience, and just more depth, which again is something that Oregon needed, having to replace a handful of pretty good.
And some of the guys that we didn't necessarily touch on that I do want to give a shout out to, right? We covered Jordan Birch. We covered a guy like Tatum Tuioti, Jamari Caldwell. I got to learn how to say his name better because he's a guy that we're going to be talking a lot about in the fall. Now, you take a look at other guys. I thought Tyone Gray, true freshman early enrollee, he looks like a guy that can play snaps in 2024. The Oregon fans already know. Like, I was on the wagon. I was on the Oregon Ducks wagon in the 2024. After that spring game, that I'm even more on the wagon, as if I couldn't be any more on. And Dill, one other thing to note, it's a really damn good offensive line Oregon had. That's not one of those examples where one side's dominating because the other side stinks. That's some of the better offensive line play they're going to see all year. Even in
that's why Tuioti stands out the way he does, because he was just man-to-man versus Josh Connerly a handful of times, and just, again, doing what we kind of described, just showing ultra good polish in that knack for winning on the edge and doing the things that, again, didn't necessarily see enough from last year from Oregon, where you didn't see your defensive ends beating guys cleanly or consistently. I think Tuioti can give them that. And again, as they kind of bring those other guys along, like Mateo, you and some of the others, that they can do that. I don't see what the hole is exactly in this team, because
ain't no holes, brother. Ain't no holes. Appreciate y'all rocking with the fellas again. This has been a program that we're going to be talking a lot about. It's been a blast to talk about. Appreciate y'all, you guys, always rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.